All right. So this is a presentation that I'm about to give at the 2022 Rethinking Hell Conference in Evansville, Indiana. And I wanted to make it available for those who couldn't attend, as well as those who will be attending but might want to look at the information I'm presenting in the future. Um, there may be some changes between now and when I give the presentation, but this should be pretty close to what I'll be saying at the conference. So in this presentation, I'm going to be arguing that the Bible presents the future judgment of Satan and the demons as complete annihilation and not eternal conscious torment, as many suppose. So instead of thinking of Satan and the demons as, being tortured forever in hell, think instead of them at the end being utterly destroyed. And here's my here's my slideshow. And a graphic that I made there that is a ripoff of the horror film Jason Goes to Hell about the guy in the hockey mask who kills people. So I sort of took the background and the title and adjusted it. I don't expect a lot of people are going to get that reference, but it makes me happy, so I'm keeping it. All right, so before I get into it, a little bit of house cleaning or housekeeping. First, some notes about terminology. So in popular parlance, angel is kind of a catch-all term, and it refers to really any good spiritual being, while demon, except for God, while demon refers to any bad spiritual being. And scholars have debated the accuracy of this nomenclature. It's a little more complicated than that, but I'll use that simple angel-demon dichotomy throughout the presentation just for the sake of convenience. Other terms that are used for angels in Scripture, which will be relevant for our discussion, include sons of God, B'nai Elohim, that's one, sons of the Most High, B'nai Elyon, gods, which is Elohim, which could actually refer to God as well. It's kind of an interesting word because it can be a title for the one God, but it's a plural form. So it can also be used to refer to gods and to these sort of higher level angels. And then finally, we have stars / host of heaven. And there's some different words that are used there. So I'm leaving that, as it is. And all of these words refer to angelic beings, and they're all going to be important in the presentation that I'm going to be making here. All right, actually, before I flip over. Secondly, I want to address ahead of time that some of the arguments I'm going to make are built on a theological framework, which is sometimes called divine counsel theology. Dr. Michael Heiser also calls it the Deuteronomy 32 worldview, and you'll see why that is later. The framework, this divine counsel framework, divine counsel theology, reads from the Old Testament the idea that God delegates authority to and consults with a council of angels. One familiar place where this occurs is the story of the punishment of Ahab in 1 Kings 22, and I'll quote it. And Micaiah said, "Therefore, hear the word of the Lord. I saw the Lord sitting on his throne, and all the host of heaven standing beside him on his right hand and on his left. And the Lord said, Who will entice Ahab that he may go up and fall at Ramoth Gilead? And one said one thing, and another said another. Then a spirit came forward and stood before the Lord, saying, I will entice him. And the Lord said to him, By what means? And he said, I will go out, and I will be a lying spirit in the mouth of all his prophets. And he said, You are to entice him, and you shall succeed. Go out and do so. Now, therefore, behold, the Lord has put a lying spirit in the mouth of all these your prophets. The Lord has declared disaster for you." So this is Micaiah speaking to King Ahab, who wants to engage in this battle. He consults with all of his false prophets who are going to give him good news. But Micaiah is the one who speaks actually for the Lord and tells him the truth. Nevertheless, Ahab does actually go into battle, and everything happens as it's been said. But here we do have this divine counsel idea. There's this council of people that, or angels rather, that God consults with. So which is, that may seem strange if you don't think of what God wants to do as participatory. You feel like he's the head of everything. He shouldn't have to participate or ask people to help, but he chooses to. And that's an example of that. Divine counsel theology was once more strongly associated with liberal theologians who claimed that it undermined conservative claims of monotheism in the Hebrew Bible. But believing scholars like Michael Heiser, who I mentioned, Ben Witherington, the Bible Project's Tim Mackey, they've shown that this idea in no way undermines God's uniqueness, since he is still the uncreated creator and judge of the other members of the divine council. Those who are interested in more resources about divine council theology, any of the other major topics I'll discuss today, or if you just want to check out my stuff, you can visit the link that's at the bottom of the PowerPoint there. And if you're watching this video, you might have already done that. It's at cantus-firmus.com/rh22. So housekeeping is done. So now we can get into it. All right. So here's the problem that we're dealing with here. There are many Christians who are open to the idea of conditional immortality for humans. We can say, yeah, maybe I could see where, God is going to destroy evil humans. That seems reasonable, but they still doubt that it applies to spiritual beings like angels or demons and Satan. In other words, they can imagine lost humans being destroyed, but it seems more likely to them that Satan and the demons might still suffer eternal conscious torment. As I've listened, As I've listened to their arguments, I've noticed a few reasons consistently given for their skepticism about the conditional immortality of angels. First of all, Revelation 20, verse 10 actually suggests ongoing torment for Satan. It reads, "And the devil who deceived them was thrown into the lake of fire and brimstone, where the beast and the false prophet are also, and they will be tormented day and night forever and ever." Secondly, spiritual beings don't have bodies, which are prone to decay, so it's easier to imagine them being immortal like God. This seems even more likely because angels and demons are described as still existing over long periods of time in the Bible. So, for instance, Satan is a character who lives in Acts throughout the scriptures, both Old and New Testament. So, I mean, he's lived an awful long time. Maybe he just doesn't die, you know what I mean? And the third thing here is that Satan is so exceptionally bad that destruction seems like an insufficient punishment for him. Actually, before I flip over, one of the so the problem with 3, that Satan is so exceptionally bad, destruction seems like insufficient punishment for him. The problem with that is that it's based on what our own sense of justice requires and not on what God's sense of justice requires. It's kind of an assumption that we're making. The problem with number 2 is that it's more like a hunch than a biblically based argument. The average human lives longer than the average housefly, but that doesn't mean humans can't die. Conditional immortality does not posit how long a person, human, angelic, or otherwise, will live. Its key claim is actually about why we live at all. The answer is that we exist because God desires it. Since this is so, we will live as long as he wills it. When it comes to reasons 2 and 3, the real question which we must answer then is whether God wills for the spiritual beings in rebellion to live forever or not. We might answer a question like that through philosophical speculation about God's purposes. For instance, we could argue that fallen spiritual beings will live forever because God thinks that they deserve eternal conscious torment, or because God is glorified by their ongoing punishment. Conversely, if we take a conditionalist viewpoint, we might assert that God does not want the demons to live forever because he desires to remove all evil from his good creation. But I think we can do better than that kind of mere theological, philosophical speculation, as interesting as it can be. And what we can do is look a little more closely at what the biblical data tells us about the fate of the demons. So if you're like me, you spent years reading your Old Testament and missing one of the most significant passages about angelic beings in the entire Bible. Here's how it reads in the NIV. "When the Most High gave the nations their inheritance, when he divided all mankind, he set up boundaries for the peoples according to the number of the sons of Israel." It's Deuteronomy 32:8 in the NIV. Did you catch it? Did you catch the super important reference to angels? No? Well, let's read it in another translation. Here's the ESV. "When the Most High gave to the nations their inheritance, when he divided mankind, he fixed the borders of the peoples according to the number of the sons of God." So not sons of Israel, but sons of God. So which is it? Sons of God is a title for a class of angelic beings, right? So, but sons of Israel just refers to Israelites. So, where's this discrepancy coming from here? Well, the discrepancy comes from the fact that the NIV and a lot of other translations that you can pick up are going to use the medieval Masoretic text as its underlying Hebrew text, which is pretty normal. It's this very kind of complete tradition of the Hebrew Bible, but it's kind of late, not nearly as old as the Dead Sea Scrolls, for example. And so the Masoretic text, this medieval Hebrew text, reads Sons of Israel. But the ESV relies on the Dead Sea Scrolls, which were roughly contemporaneous with Jesus. And that's where it gets the reading Sons of God. According to this reading, there was a moment in time when God split up humanity into distinct nations, all except Israel, and gave them over to angelic beings called the sons of God to superintend. And he guesses on when God might have done that in the biblical timeline. So I can't hear you, but I'm going to assume that you might be saying the Tower of Babel, in which case, yeah, very good, very wise. That's absolutely correct. So yeah, so the Tower of Babel, that is where God split humanity up, right? So in that story, if you don't remember, humanity unites to build a tower that reaches to the heavens to make a name for themselves, and God punishes them for their hubris by confusing their languages, with the result that they're divided into 70 distinct nations, and that's in Genesis 10 through 11. And the 70 number becomes important in Jewish and Christian thought later as a number which represents all the nations. Okay, so let's say that we go with the Masoretic text, even though it's later, and we say, okay, Masoretic text says God divided the nations up according to the number of the sons of Israel. Okay, well, what's that number? Do we go with the over 1 million Israelites that were stated to have left Egypt for the Exodus? The 12 sons of Jacob? Or do you go with the number Exodus 1:5 tells us went into Egypt? 70. So 70 comes back again. If we go with Exodus 1:5 for a number, then whichever reading you go with, sons of God or sons of Israel, you still have the nations being divided into 70. But Israel stands out because, according to the next verse in Deuteronomy 32, the Lord's portion is his people, Jacob his allotted heritage. So if God gets Israel, who gets the nations? The Masoretic text doesn't tell us, but the Dead Sea Scrolls do. So does the Greek translation of the Old Testament called the Septuagint, which is also roughly contemporaneous with Jesus. The Septuagint doesn't go with sons of Israel, nor does it say sons of God. It goes with a third reading. It softens it to angels of God, which means the same thing as sons of God, but sounds a little bit more like strict monotheism. Sons of God feels like God has some competition, maybe, right? So angels of God is kind of a softer way of saying the same thing. The best explanation for how all these different readings came about is that sons of God came first, angels of God comes later, softens the language while still saying basically the same thing, and then sons of Israel comes even later as an even more subtle reference to the events at Babel for those who were in the know, right? Those who could figure out what the number was. Oh, 70. Oh, yeah, that's the number that shows up at Babel. That's what's being talked about, right? And also, I'm going to bring in another translation here of Deuteronomy 32. This is a very loose Aramaic translation called Targum Pseudo-Jonathan, and it probably also dates from the Middle Ages, and it seems aware of at least two of these other readings and combines them in an interesting way, tries to split the difference. It reads, when the Most High made allotment of the world unto the nations which proceeded from the sons of Noah, in the separation of the writings and languages of the children of men at the time of division, he cast the lot among the 70 angels, the princes of the nations, with whom is the revelation to oversee the city. Even at that time, he established the limits of the nations according to the sum of the number of the 70 souls of Israel who went down into Egypt. So he tries to have his cake and eat it too. He goes, yeah, sons of Israel, that's 70 in Egypt, right? But he also does say, yeah, 70 angels. So he doesn't go along with the Sons of God reading. It's possible he didn't even know about it. But he does go with the he does reference the angels and the 70 children of Israel, right? All right. This is all going to make sense, I promise. But I need to lay some groundwork here first. So we also know that there were Jewish and Christian documents from before the medieval period that understood this Deuteronomy 32 text to be clearly speaking of angelic beings placed over the nations. So we have, for example, the Book of Jubilees. It's a highly influential intertestamental Jewish writing, and here's how it retells the Deuteronomy 32 passage. Quote, he chose Israel to be his people, and he sanctified it and gathered it from amongst all the children of men. For there are many nations and many peoples, and all are his, and over all hath he placed spirits in authority to lead them astray from him. But over Israel he did not appoint any angel or spirit, for he alone is their ruler. Right? Sirach, another important Jewish document. It's even included in the Roman Catholic and Eastern Orthodox canons, though not in the Protestant Bible, and it paraphrases our passage thusly. Quote, for in the division of the nations of the whole earth he set a ruler over every people, but Israel is the Lord's portion. Now, that little part in italics there is missing in some manuscripts, but it's still basically the same teaching that God set a ruler over the people, but Israel is the Lord's portion. It's still a Deuteronomy 32 thing. But when you have that division of the nations of the whole earth thing, that does help kind of clinch the reference. So, but nevertheless, it's still basically saying the same thing. This understanding can be found throughout the church fathers as well, including in Jerome. I'll just give that one example. In his comments on Daniel 10, another Old Testament passage that speaks of angelic powers over nations, Jerome wrote simply, quote, this is in accordance with what we read in Deuteronomy, assuming that basically all of his readers are going to know exactly what he's talking about. So we've kind of abandoned what was the Jewish and early Christian consensus about what's going on in Deuteronomy 32 here. And all this fascinating background, I promise, is going to help us to understand another passage which speaks directly to judgment against rebellious angels. Psalm 82. Psalm 82 peels back the curtain and gives us a look into God's divine counsel among the angelic beings who are given charge over the nations. It reads, quote, God has taken his place in the divine council. In the midst of the gods, he holds judgment. How long will you judge unjustly and show partiality to the wicked? Give justice to the weak and the fatherless. Maintain the right of the afflicted and the destitute. Rescue the weak and the needy. Deliver them from the hand of the wicked. They have neither knowledge nor understanding. This is speaking about the sons of God. They walk about in darkness. All the foundations of the earth are shaken. I said, this is God speaking, you are gods, sons of the Most High, all of you. Nevertheless, like men, you shall die and fall like any prince. Arise, O God, judge the earth, for you shall inherit all the nations. Not just Israel, all the nations. All right. I had to flip my page here. Sorry about that. So let's note the relevant features of the text that establish who the players are. First, the scene is a divine council scene. God judges in the midst of the gods, the Elohim. In other divine council settings, the location is a heavenly one, and the participants are not human. So some want to make Psalm 82 about this sort of God judging the Israelite leaders, but all the language and the terminology and just the setting match what we read in other passages where we're talking about a heavenly setting with a divine council of angelic beings. God is charging the gods with gross mismanagement of the nations which they've been given. The psalmist looks forward to the day when God will take back the nations which he gave up and make sure justice is done. A third feature that we should emphasize here, the gods do not expect to die like men, but they will. This last point is most important for our purposes. These spiritual beings, these Elohim, the sons of God, whatever you want to call them, they don't expect they'll die like men do, right? But God is quite explicit on this point. They will die, just like men do. And this raises two very significant questions. What does it mean for men to die? And what would it mean for angels to die in like fashion? One traditional answer is that when a human being dies, their body dies, but their spirit lives on forever. But this can't be said of angels. Angels are spirits by nature. So God can't be warning them that their bodies will fall apart even as their souls go on living. That's not the message here. Instead, this must be death as it appears to human observers. So when you think of someone that you may have known who's passed away, you note the cessation of personality, of knowledge, of experience. Maybe they go on in some way, but not in your experience of them, right? Phenomenologically, as far as you can tell, there's nothing there anymore, right? Another Hebrew writer, the author of Ecclesiastes, uses that quote, "The living know that they will die, but the dead know nothing," and that's our experience of what death looks like from this side of it, right? So, thus, we're forced to conclude that angels in rebellion are promised precisely what humans in rebellion are promised, which is destruction. Whatever happens to the humans is going to happen to these angels in rebellion. And because angels don't have bodies, we can't say that it's their bodies being destroyed, but their souls continuing on, right? All right. As mentioned before, another word used in the Bible to identify the stars or the angels is stars or host. Job 38:7 identifies the sons of God who shouted for joy as they watched God creating the earth as, quote, morning stars. In Isaiah 14:13, the Satan figure schemes to take over God's position in the divine council. He makes a plan to ascend above the stars of God, right? This identification of stars with angels also influenced later Jewish writers, as is evidenced by the animal apocalypse of 1 Enoch 90, symbolizing the angelic sons of God as stars. In the Hebrew Bible, host of heaven can refer to stars, it can refer to angels or gods, or it can refer to both. Although, frankly, I would say all of these passages are kind of ambiguous. You could argue that both are in mind. I would say that angels or gods are probably a pretty significant element of all these passages, because we're talking about things that the nations are worshiping. But you could also just read them as, well, they're worshiping these angels, or sorry, these stars that, these things, that balls of gas that float through the sky or whatever. But it's hard to tease apart, frankly. Oh, yeah, one more. Yes. So much like, oh, sorry, I'm skipping ahead a little bit. So taking this information and adding to it what we learned about the sons of God as guardians over the nations, an apocalyptic passage like Isaiah 24:21 comes into greater focus. Quote, on that day, the Lord will punish the host of heaven in heaven and the kings of the earth on the earth. So if we think of these sons of God as functioning like kings over the nations, there's a parallel here, right? You have the host of heaven, the angel who's the head of this nation, and then you have the king of the nation on the earth, and they're both punished by God. There's sort of a parallel punishing that's happening, right? So when Isaiah, so much like in, before I jump ahead, much like in Psalm 82, the fates of the rebellious sons of God are tied to the fates of the earthly kings that they parallel. When Isaiah returns to discuss the punishment of the host of heaven, he tells us that they will, quote, rot away and, quote, fall as leaves fall from the vine. This punishment is placed in parallel with what God will do to the host of the nations. And that's the phrase that's used. He's devoted them to destruction, has given them over for slaughter. I say that's the phrase that's used, and I don't have it in quote marks here, but I'm almost positive that it is. I'd have to go back and look at it to be sure, but I'm almost positive that is. Host of the nations. It's kind of an interesting parallel, isn't it? So yeah, all right. So we've made the case that spiritual beings, apart from God anyway, are not by nature immortal. We've even looked at biblical passages that communicate that some of them will actually be destroyed. But what about Satan in particular? How do we get around Revelation 20:10, which literally tells us that Satan will be tormented day and night forever? Well, before we look at Revelation, let's wrap up our discussion of the Old Testament witness on this topic. Though some scholars question the identification of Satan with the kingly figures in Isaiah 14 and Ezekiel 28, there is both textual evidence and tradition in its favor. Though since we're limited on time, you'll just have to take my word for it that there's good evidence and tradition for reading Isaiah 14 and Ezekiel 28 as to be references to Satan. But we will look at the passages themselves and see what they say. So Isaiah 14, a judgment is issued against the king of Babylon, and it compares this evil human leader to another figure, a star who sought to ascend to heaven above the other stars of God and establish his throne in place of God's. The consequence of the judgment is that he will be brought down to Sheol, the grave, but as an object of shame, he will not be buried. I should have read that while that was up, but I didn't. This is the first time I'm going through this, so hopefully maybe I'll have the kinks worked out before I do this in a couple of days. It's admittedly difficult to separate what applies to the king of Babylon, what applies to Satan, and what applies to both. But in light of the strong connections between spiritual beings and earthly kings that they rule over, that we've seen throughout Scripture so far, it seems quite reasonable to suppose the judgment applies in some ways to both. This is a theme that comes up, dual judgment, not just for the kings over the nations that they rule, but the spiritual beings, these sons of God, who also rule over those nations in some sense, right? Who superintend them and who do a terrible job of it. I have that on there twice. Oh, look at that. I will have to delete that slide. All right. Next one, Ezekiel 28. Something very similar can be said about the prince of Tyre in Ezekiel 28. This prince fancies himself a god, but God warns him that he's a mere man and he will die like any other human being. This brings to mind another arrogant figure, an angelic being, a cherub in Eden, the garden of God, and this spiritual being became unrighteous and was cast down to the earth. Clearly, I think Satan is in view here. And what is the punishment that God has for this rebellious angel? Quote, I brought fire out from your midst, it consumed you, and I turned you to ashes on the earth in the sight of all who saw you. All who know you among the peoples are appalled at you. You have come to a dreadful end and shall be no more forever. Now, of course, maybe that's just a reference to the king of Tyre, the prince of Tyre, right? And it doesn't apply to Satan at all. Although, it's kind of hard to separate them out when basically the king of Tyre, prince of Tyre, is called Satan and described as having been in the Garden of Eden, right, as a cherub. So I think that the idea of dual punishments here still seems to make the most sense. All right, so that catches us up on the Old Testament. Now we can turn to the book of Revelation and what it has to say about the eternal fate of the devil. Revelation 20, 10 through 14. Let's read it. The devil who deceived them was thrown into the lake of fire and sulfur where the beast and the false prophet were. They will be tormented day and night forever and ever. Then death and Hades were thrown into the lake of fire. This is the second death, the lake of fire. What are the relevant features of this text? 1, the devil is thrown into the lake of fire and sulfur following the beast and the false prophet. They go first, he comes next. 2, the punishment is said to be torment day and night forever and ever. 3, death and Hades are also thrown into the lake of fire. 4, the lake of fire is identified with the second death. Now, point 1 here should spark a lot of controversy. Conditionalists and traditionalists can both affirm that. Those who believe in eternal conscious torment and those who believe in the annihilation of the wicked can both say, yeah, sure, that seems to be what's happening in Revelation here. Point 2 is tougher for the conditionalists. It suggests that eternal conscious torment is what the devil is going to experience. So that needs to be satisfactorily answered by conditionalists. Point 3 and 4, though, suggest conditionalism, suggest annihilation. Why? Well, for a few reasons. For one, it seems to follow from these 2 points that the lake of fire destroys what's thrown into it. What good would it do to torment death and Hades? What would that even communicate? Death being tormented. That's not what's going on here. The point being made is that death and Hades are destroyed and will be no more. If the lake of fire destroys death and Hades, doesn't that at least imply that it would also destroy Satan? Secondly, second death suggests that death and not eternal torment is what the lake of fire produces. And once again, death, as we seem to experience it, is the cessation of personality. The body that once spoke and thought and did all these things no longer does, right? So second death suggests something like that again. This isn't just what the word second death themselves seem to suggest, though, it's not just, well, yeah, second death, I can put that together and imagine what that looks like. It's also what second death meant in outside literature. So Chris Date and William Tanksley of Rethinking Hell highlighted this point quite effectively in a presentation they made on the case for conditionalism from Revelation, which I've linked to at cantus-firmus.com/rh22. One of the most intriguing outside uses of the phrase second death appears in an Aramaic Targum's paraphrase of a judgment in Jeremiah 51:39. The Hebrew of Jeremiah here reads, quote, "They will sleep a perpetual sleep and not wake, declares the Lord." But the Targum reads, "They shall die the second death and shall not live for the world to come." So that's what second death has suggested to how that word has been used, or that phrase has been used in other Jewish sources. Thirdly, while this point could be debated, it seems likely that the beast and false prophet are not individuals, but abstract powers or systems. What would it mean for a system to be tormented? What would it mean for to say that a nation let's see, what's another way of saying that? It's not even just a nation. It's kind of this sort of conglomeration of powerful people and economic systems and stuff. Anyway, it's hard to imagine what that could possibly mean to say that it's tortured, right? Or tormented. So the point seems to be that Jesus is destroying this evil world system, which the beast represents, and he's replacing it with the kingdom of God. That's basically these images also that are in Revelation come from Daniel 7, and that's clearly what's going on there, which so in Daniel 7:11, the beast is slain and then thrown into the fire to be burned up. This happens prior to the Son of Man establishing his kingdom. In other words, the beast is annihilated. Isn't that ultimately the same message that John is communicating in Revelation? So all this leaves us with one thorny problem. The Old Testament tells us that the devil and his demons will be destroyed. Revelation also seems to suggest it, except in this one little place where it says that Satan will be tormented day and night forever and ever. So how do we resolve this difficulty? In Revelation 20, 4 abstract concepts, death, Hades, the beast, and the false prophet, are thrown into the lake of fire and are destroyed by it. Right? That's the clear message, despite the confusing language of torment forever and ever. I say confusing, but maybe I could say apocalyptic. This is a certain work of literature where the words don't always mean what they sound like literally, right? So if that's the clear message, that these things are going to be destroyed, even though they're described as being tormented forever and ever, should we think of the fifth object, Satan, as the one exception where something thrown into the fire, the lake of fire, is not destroyed by it? If there were no other biblical data about the fate of Satan, I'd say it was a possibility. But the rest of Scripture is univocal on this subject, or univocal. That sounds fancier, doesn't it? This univocality, along with the fact that the forever torment language actually communicates death in regard to the beast and the false prophet, who are said to be tormented with Satan forever, lead us to conclude that torment is also apocalyptic language, which points to destruction in the case of Satan as well. In sum, the fate of Satan and the demons will be the same as those humans who rejected God: utter destruction. Thanks for listening. As you see, I had some bugs in the presentation there. I wasn't really sure where to click. Hopefully, like I said, that gets a little bit better. But I appreciate you listening or watching. There's more resources at cantus-firmus.com/rh22 that might be useful. And that's all I got for you. So looking forward to the presentation at the Rethinking Hell Conference. That'll be a lot of fun. But if you're watching and you have any comments or questions, you can email me, Cody@cantus-firmus.com. If you're not sure how to spell Cantus Firmus, it's right there at the bottom of the PowerPoint. Anyway, thank you so much. See, I said thank you so much, but now I'm still recording, so there we go.